The air inside the bank was crisp and cool, the hum of conversation mixing with the rhythmic beeps of ATM machines and the soft rustle of paper being shuffled. Customers moved through the space with practiced ease, their steps purposeful, their attention fixed on their own business. Marcus Davis, dressed in a tailored navy suit that spoke of understated elegance, stepped through the glass doors. The faint scent of leather from his polished shoes followed him as he crossed the threshold, his presence commanding attention even from those too polite to stare directly. A quiet hush seemed to follow him, subtle but noticeable, as heads turned slightly, some out of curiosity, others with an edge of something unspoken but familiar. Marcus scanned the room briefly, his dark eyes calm but sharp, taking in the scene with the ease of someone who had walked into spaces like these many times before. He had learned to carry himself with confidence, his broad shoulders squared, his steps deliberate. This wasn't arrogance, it was survival. Growing up in a world that constantly questioned his place had taught him the importance of standing tall, no matter the setting. Today was no different. He moved toward the teller counter, the thick folder in his hand, a symbol of the work he had poured his heart into. Inside were documents tied to a real estate deal he had been working on for years, a project that wasn't just about him, but about the town he had come from and the lives he hoped to change. This was his chance, his moment to make good on promises he had made to himself and others. As Marcus reached the counter, he offered a polite smile to the young teller on duty, a woman who seemed nervous but professional. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "I'd like to make a withdrawal." He slid his ID and bank card across the counter, watching as the teller glanced down at them. "Of course, sir," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. She began typing into her computer, her brows knitting together as she focused on the screen. Before Marcus could even begin to relax, a shadow loomed over the counter. Walter Grayson, the bank manager, appeared as if summoned by an unspoken alarm. He was a man in his late 50s, his graying hair combed neatly back, his suit pressed to perfection, and his expression sharp enough to cut glass. Walter wasn't the kind of man who commanded respect. He demanded it, often by belittling those around him. "What seems to be the issue here?" Walter's voice carried across the room, loud enough to draw the attention of a few customers nearby. Marcus turned slightly, meeting the man's icy gaze. "No issue," Marcus replied evenly, "just making a withdrawal." Walter's eyes flicked to the teller, who had frozen mid-typing, her fingers hovering uncertainly above the keyboard. Then he looked back at Marcus, his lips curling into a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A withdrawal, you say? Of how much, exactly?" Marcus didn't flinch, though he could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. $100,000, he said, his tone measured, his confidence unshaken. The room seemed to shift slightly, the subtle hum of background noise quieting, as if even the walls were waiting for what came next. Walter's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, replaced by a look of thinly veiled suspicion. "That's quite a sum," he said, his tone suddenly sharper, colder. "Might I ask what it's for?" Marcus straightened, his jaw tightening just enough to be noticeable. "I wasn't aware I needed to disclose my intentions to make a withdrawal from my own account." His words were calm, but there was an edge to them now, a quiet defiance that dared Walter to push further. Walter chuckled, the sound forced and hollow. "Of course not," he said. "It's just unusual, that's all. Perhaps we should verify some things first." He gestured toward the teller, who hesitated before handing him Marcus's documents. Walter glanced at them briefly, then handed them back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Everything's in order," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence that had settled around them. "I'd like to proceed." Walter didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his expression shifting to one of mock concern. You understand, Mr. Davis, that we have certain protocols for large withdrawals, especially for accounts flagged for unusual activity." "Flagged?" Marcus repeated, his brows furrowing. "And what exactly does that mean?" Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial, but loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Well, there have been some, let's say, discrepancies with accounts like yours in the past. We just want to make sure everything is above board." Marcus's stomach tightened, a familiar knot of frustration and anger beginning to form. He knew exactly what Walter was implying, even if the man didn't say it outright. "Accounts like yours." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "I see," Marcus said finally, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "And what would you like to verify?" Walter leaned back slightly, a smug smile creeping onto his face. "Just a few details. Perhaps you could provide additional identification, maybe a tax return, proof of income." The words hit like a slap, each one a calculated move to undermine, to belittle. Marcus's hand tightened around the edge of the counter, his knuckles whitening, but he didn't let his composure slip. He had faced this kind of treatment before, too many times to count, and he knew that losing his temper would only give Walter more power. "I've already provided my identification," Marcus said, his tone firm now. "And my account has been with this bank for over 5 years. You'll find everything you need is already on file." Walter's smile widened, as if he had been waiting for this exact response. "Be that as it may, I think it's in everyone's best interest if we conduct a full review before proceeding. These things take time, you understand." Marcus stared at him, his mind racing. Every second that passed was another delay, another obstacle standing between him and the deal that could change everything. He thought of the people back in his hometown, the ones counting on him to make this happen. He thought of his mother's words, her voice steady in his memory. "Hold your head high, Marcus. Don't let them see you break." "Very well," Marcus said finally, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Let's conduct your review, but let me be clear. Any delay that jeopardizes my transaction will be your responsibility, not mine." Walter's snug expression faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "I'll do my best to expedite the process," he said, though his tone suggested the exact opposite. As Walter walked away, Marcus stood at the counter, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, some sympathetic, others curious, and a few unmistakably judgmental. But he didn't care. He wasn't going to let this man, or anyone else, stand in his way. The day was far from over, and Marcus knew this was only the beginning. Hene. The sound of Marcus's shoes hitting the cracked pavement echoed through the small, quiet streets of Ridgeline, his hometown. The air smelled faintly of dust and fried food, and the faint hum of an old radio drifted from a nearby porch. He paused, taking in the scene, the place where it had all begun. Ridgeline wasn't much to look at. Rows of weathered houses with peeling paint and sagging porches, a corner store that doubled as the town's heartbeat, and an old playground where the swings creaked in the wind. But to Marcus, it was everything. It was where he learned to fight, not with his fists, but with his mind. It was where his dreams took root, small and fragile at first, but unyielding in the face of everything life threw at him. "Marcus, you're gonna be something one day. Mark my words." His mother's voice echoed in his mind as clearly as if she were standing next to him. Back then, her words had felt like a lifeline, pulling him out of the deep waters of doubt that had threatened to drown him. She had worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to make sure he and his little sister, Lila, had enough to eat and clothes on their backs. And when the lights went out because she couldn't pay the bill, she'd light candles and call it family night. making it feel like an adventure instead of a struggle. His mother, Evelyn Davis, was the strongest person he'd ever known. Small in stature but fierce in spirit, she had a way of commanding respect without raising her voice. "Don't ever let them make you feel small," she used to tell him. "You're worth more than gold, Marcus. Don't you forget that." Those words had carried him through the toughest times, through the hunger, the stares from wealthier kids at school, the whispers about his family's situation. He carried them with him now, like armor. The sound of a screen door slamming pulled Marcus from his thoughts. A little girl with wild curls came barreling down the steps of the house in front of him, her laughter ringing out like music. "Uncle Marcus," she yelled, her arms stretched wide as she ran to him. He knelt just in time to catch her, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around. "Hey, pumpkin, you've gotten so big," he said, his grin wide and genuine. "Mama says I'm gonna be tall like you," the girl declared proudly, her dark eyes sparkling. Marcus laughed, setting her back down. "Well, you'll be taller than me if you keep growing like this. You eating all your veggies?" She scrunched her nose. "Sometimes." Lila appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Marcus, you spoil her too much," she said with a teasing smile. She looked so much like their mother that it caught Marcus off guard for a moment. "I can't help it," he said, walking up the steps to give her a hug. "How's everything?" Lila's smile faltered for a brief second, but she quickly masked it. "Same as always," she replied, "but we're getting by." Getting by. That phrase was a familiar one. It had defined so much of their lives growing up. Marcus glanced at the house, noticing the same cracks in the wood, the same leaning mailbox that had been there since they were kids. He felt a pang of guilt. He had promised himself he would change things, not just for himself, but for them, for everyone in this town that had been forgotten by the world outside. As they sat on the porch, Lila handed him a glass of sweet tea, and they watched his niece, Mia, play in the yard. "Mama would be proud of you," Lila said softly, breaking the silence. Marcus looked at her, his jaw tightening. "I'm trying, Lila. I'm doing everything I can." She placed a hand on his arm. "You've already done more than enough. Just don't forget to take care of yourself too." But taking care of himself felt like a luxury he couldn't afford, not when so many people were counting on him. He thought about the real estate project he'd been working on for years, a community center and affordable housing development that could breathe new life into Ridgeline. It wasn't just a business venture, it was personal. He wanted kids like Mia to have a place to dream, to grow, to believe that they could be more than what the world expected of them. Those expectations had nearly crushed him once. He remembered the day in high school when his guidance counselor had pulled him aside. "Marcus, have you considered vocational training? College might be a bit ambitious." The words had stung, not because they questioned his ability, but because they assumed he didn't deserve more. That was the first time he realized the world didn't see him the way his mother did. To them, he was just another poor black kid from a rundown town, invisible, forgettable. But Marcus had refused to be defined by their limited vision. He worked harder than anyone else, earning a full scholarship to a prestigious university. Even then, he had faced roadblocks, professors who assumed he was there to meet a diversity quota, classmates who questioned his intelligence, and later, employers who saw his potential but were reluctant to fully invest in him. Each time, he rose above it, not because he wanted to prove them wrong, but because he wanted to prove himself right. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was an email from his lawyer. The deal was moving forward, but he needed the funds by the end of the week to secure the property. His chest tightened slightly. It was all falling into place, but just barely. There was no room for error. Mia ran up to him, holding a dandelion in her hand. "Make a wish, Uncle Marcus," she said, her voice full of excitement. He smiled, taking the dandelion and closing his eyes for a moment. "I wish for a better future. For Mia. For all of us." He blew the seeds into the wind, watching as they scattered, carried away by forces he couldn't control but trusted nonetheless. As the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the town, Marcus stood, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I should get going," he said, hugging Lila and kissing Mia on the forehead. "But I'll be back soon." Lila nodded, her eyes shining with unspoken words. "We'll be here." As Marcus drove away, the weight of his responsibility settled back onto his shoulders. He thought about the obstacles he had already overcome, the countless moments when he could have given up but didn't. He thought about the people who had doubted him, the systems that had tried to hold him back, and the quiet strength his mother had instilled in him. This wasn't just about a deal or a paycheck. It was about dignity, about proving that no matter how many times the world tried to knock you down, you could rise again. He clenched the steering wheel, his jaw set. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready. This was for Ridgeline, for his family, and for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all of them, and he wasn't going to lose. Marcus stood at the counter, his eyes calm but focused as he slid his ID and account details toward the teller. The young woman behind the glass looked nervous, glancing up at him before quickly typing something into her computer. She couldn't have been more than 22, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with the keyboard. Marcus offered her a polite smile, trying to ease her nerves, but deep down, he could feel the familiar tension beginning to coil in his chest. He had been here before, too many times to count. The little signs, the hesitant glances, the subtle shifts in tone, they were always the same. "How much did you say you'd like to withdraw, sir?" the teller asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 100,000, Marcus replied, his voice steady and firm. He saw her eyes widen slightly, the number clearly catching her off guard. For a moment, she seemed unsure of what to do next, her fingers pausing mid-type. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his tone polite but pointed. He knew better than to let irritation seep into his voice, even though he could already feel the storm brewing. Before she could answer, a voice cut through the air like a knife. "What seems to be the issue here?" Marcus turned to see Walter Grayson approaching, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor with purpose. The man exuded authority, or at least, the kind of authority that came from years of lording over people he considered beneath him. His graying hair was neatly combed, his suit immaculate, but his smile was anything but warm. Walter didn't even glance at the teller. His sharp, pale blue eyes were fixed squarely on Marcus, sizing him up like a predator circling prey. "No issue," Marcus said calmly, meeting Walter's gaze without flinching. "I'm making a withdrawal." Walter's eyes flicked to the teller's screen, then back to Marcus. "A withdrawal, you say? And how much are we talking about?" 100,000, Marcus repeated, his tone unwavering. Walter's eyebrows shot up, and for a moment, his carefully composed expression faltered. Then he let out a low, condescending chuckle. "Well, that's quite a sum," he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "Might I ask what it's for?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, his jaw tightening. "It's for a business transaction," he said simply, "and I don't believe I'm required to explain my financial decisions to you." Walter's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course not," he said smoothly, "but large withdrawals like this are uncommon. We have protocols in place to ensure the safety and legitimacy of our clients' transactions." "Legitimacy," Marcus repeated, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Are you suggesting my request isn't legitimate?" Walter held up his hands in a mock gesture of innocence. "Not at all," he said. "I'm just saying that we need to be thorough. You understand, don't you? After all, we wouldn't want any misunderstandings." The tension in the room was palpable now, and Marcus could feel the weight of several pairs of eyes on him. A few customers had paused to watch the interaction, their curiosity thinly veiled. He noticed the young teller glancing nervously between him and Walter, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the keyboard. Marcus straightened, his broad shoulders squared as he met Walter's gaze head-on. "I've been a client of this bank for over 5 years," he said, his voice steady and measured. "My account is in good standing, and all the necessary documentation is on file. So unless there's a specific issue, I'd like to proceed with my withdrawal." Walter's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Be that as it may," he said, his tone now sharper. "I think it's best if we take a moment to review everything thoroughly. These things take time, you see. It's for your own protection, Mr. Davis." Marcus's eyes narrowed. He knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about protocols or protection. This was about power, Walter's need to assert it and Marcus's refusal to bow to it. "I'd like to speak with someone else," Marcus said firmly. "If you're unable to assist me, perhaps the regional manager can." Walter's smile turned icy. "I'm afraid the regional manager is unavailable at the moment," he said, "but you're welcome to wait. These things can take hours, sometimes even days. We'll do our best to expedite it, of course." Marcus clenched his jaw, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He pulled out his phone and began typing a message to his legal advisor, detailing the situation. "Is there a problem, sir?" Walter asked, his tone laced with full concern. Marcus didn't look up. "No problem," he said coolly. "I'm just documenting this interaction for my records. Transparency is important, don't you think?" Walter's smile tightened, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty in the man's eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same smug arrogance. A sudden commotion near the entrance drew Marcus's attention. 2 security guards were approaching, their expressions neutral, but their presence unmistakably meant to intimidate. Marcus's stomach tightened, but he didn't let it show. He had expected this. "Is there a reason you've called security?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but loud enough for the nearby customers to hear. Walter spread his hands in a gesture of mock helplessness. "Just a precaution," he said. "We take the safety of our clients and staff very seriously." Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he turned his phone's camera on, holding it up to capture the scene. "This is Marcus Davis, a long-standing client of this bank," he said, his voice steady. "I'm currently being denied access to my own funds without cause, and security has been called despite no threat or disruption. I'll be forwarding this to my legal team and the press." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Walter's face turned a shade paler, and for the first time, Marcus saw a crack in his composure. "Now, Mr. Davis," Walter began, his tone suddenly conciliatory, "there's no need for that. Let's work this out." "I've already given you everything you need," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. "Now, either you process my withdrawal, or I escalate this further." The security guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The young teller looked like she wanted to crawl under the desk, her face flushed with embarrassment. Walter hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an escape, but there was none. Marcus had taken control of the situation, and everyone knew it. Finally, Walter let out a heavy sigh. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll process your request, but next time, I suggest you give us advance notice for such a large transaction." Marcus didn't respond. He simply watched as Walter turned and walked away, his shoulders stiff with barely concealed frustration. As the teller began processing the withdrawal, Marcus glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of the onlookers who had been watching the scene unfold. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed to have been caught staring. Others gave him small, approving nods. When the teller finally handed him the stack of documents to sign, her hands were still trembling. "I'm sorry about everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not your fault," Marcus said softly, his tone kind but resolute. "But it doesn't mean it's okay." As he walked out of the bank, his funds finally in hand, Marcus felt a wave of emotions wash over him: relief, frustration, and a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Marcus sat in his car, the leather steering wheel creaking under his tightening grip. The sleek vehicle, a silent testament to his hard-earned success, felt stifling at that moment. He stared at the bank's towering facade, his reflection faintly visible in the mirrored windows. A storm churned inside him: anger, frustration, and something deeper. It wasn't just about what Walter had done to him. It was about what Walter represented. This wasn't just an isolated incident. Marcus could feel it in his bones. The condescension, the thinly veiled accusations. It was too calculated to be random. Walter wasn't just targeting him. Walter had done this before. He let out a slow breath, forcing himself to focus. Losing his cool wasn't going to solve anything. If there was one thing Marcus had learned over the years, it was that change didn't come from rage alone. It came from strategy. And Marcus had a plan. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he needed: David Hann, investigative journalist. Marcus hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button. David picked up after 2 rings, his voice sharp and direct. "Marcus Davis. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need your help, David," Marcus said, cutting straight to the point. "It's about Grayson National Bank." There was a pause on the other end. "You mean the bank you've been a client at for years?" "That's the one," Marcus said, his voice tightening. "I just had an interesting experience with their branch manager, Walter Grayson." David let out a low whistle. "Grayson, as in the Grayson family, the ones who've been running that bank for decades." Marcus's jaw clenched. "Exactly. And I think it's time someone took a closer look at how they've been running it." David's tone shifted, his curiosity piqued. "What happened?" Marcus recounted the encounter in detail, his voice steady but simmering with controlled anger. He described Walter's thinly veiled prejudice, the unnecessary hurdles, and the blatant power plays. By the time he finished, David was silent, but Marcus could hear the gears turning on the other end of the line. "Sounds like more than just a bad manager," David said finally. "You think this goes deeper?" "I don't think," Marcus said. "I know. I've seen this kind of behavior before. It's systemic. I need you to dig into their history. Loan approvals, customer complaints, employee treatment, everything." David chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You always bring me the fun jobs, Marcus. All right, I'll start looking into it, but I'll need more to go on." "You'll have it," Marcus promised. "And David, keep this quiet for now. I want them to feel safe until it's too late to cover their tracks." David's laugh was sharper this time. "You've got it. I'll be in touch." Marcus ended the call and stared at his phone for a moment before typing out another message. This one was to Amelia Torres, a civil rights attorney who specialized in discrimination cases. Amelia had been a fierce ally in the past, and Marcus knew she'd want in on this. As he waited for her response, Marcus's mind drifted back to Walter's smug face, the way he had relished every moment of their interaction. It wasn't just the insult that burned, it was the audacity. Walter had been so sure of his untouchability, so confident that his actions would have no consequences. Marcus intended to shatter that confidence. Amelia's reply came quickly. "Let's meet. My office, tomorrow, 9 a.m. Marcus smiled grimly and started his car. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Marcus walked into Amelia's office, his steps purposeful and his expression unreadable. Amelia greeted him with a firm handshake and a piercing gaze. "All right, Marcus," she said, motioning for him to sit. "Tell me everything." He laid it all out for her: the encounter with Walter, the obstacles, the thinly veiled accusations. Amelia listened intently, her sharp mind already working through the possibilities. "This isn't just about one man," Marcus said as he finished. "It's about the system he's part of. If we take him down, we take the system with him." Amelia nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're right, but we'll need evidence. Something concrete. Stories like yours are powerful, but they're just the beginning. We need records, patterns, a trail of misconduct that we can prove." "I'll get you what you need," Marcus said. "David's already digging into their history, and I've got one more lead to follow." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "What lead?" "A retired employee," Marcus said. "Someone who knows the bank's inner workings. If there's dirt to find, he'll know where to look." That afternoon, Marcus met with Charles Bennett, a former loan officer who had worked at Grayson National Bank for over 20 years before retiring under mysterious circumstances. Charles was hesitant at first, his weathered face lined with years of stress and worry. But as Marcus pressed him gently, sharing his own story and his determination to make a change, Charles began to open up. "They always found ways to justify it," Charles said, his voice low. "The denials, the delays, the excuses. It was always policy or protocol. But the truth was, they didn't want certain people like you, getting ahead." Marcus leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Do you have proof? Records, emails, anything?" Charles hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I kept some things. Didn't feel right destroying them. I'll get them to you." As Marcus left Charles's house, a sense of momentum began to build. The pieces were falling into place. With David's investigation, Amelia's legal expertise, and Charles's insider knowledge, they had the makings of a formidable case. Over the next week, David's findings began to trickle in. The patterns were undeniable. Loan denials disproportionately affected minority applicants. Complaints of discriminatory treatment had been quietly swept under the rug, and at the center of it all was Walter Grayson, whose name appeared repeatedly in internal documents that painted a damning picture. Amelia worked tirelessly, building a case that would hold up in court and in the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, Marcus began to feed carefully crafted hints to the media, ensuring that the story would gain traction without tipping off Walter or the bank. As the pressure mounted, Marcus could feel the tide beginning to turn. Walter, oblivious to the storm gathering around him, continued to operate with the same arrogance that had brought him this far. But Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before the walls came crashing down. Then, one evening, Marcus received a call from David. "We've got it," David said, his voice brimming with urgency. "A smoking gun. You're going to want to see this." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" "An email chain," David said, "from Walter himself, explicitly instructing staff to deny loans to minority applicants unless they met impossible criteria. It's bad, Marcus, really bad." A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. "Send it to Amelia. It's time we took this public." As he ended the call, Marcus felt a surge of determination. Walter thought he was untouchable. He thought he could play with people's lives without consequence, but he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The knock on the door was loud and forceful, shattering the quiet morning like a thrown brick. Marcus, seated at the kitchen table, looked up from his laptop. His mother, Evelyn, peered out the window, her face instantly clouded with worry. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling just slightly, "there's a police car outside." Marcus stood, his gut twisting. He moved to the door and opened it just as two uniformed officers stepped forward. Their expressions were a mixture of neutrality and something colder, harder to pin down. "Marcus Davis," one of them asked, his tone clipped. "Yes," Marcus replied evenly, though his chest tightened. "What's this about?" "We've received a report from Grayson National Bank," the officer said. "They're claiming you made threats against staff during your visit last week." Marcus blinked, stunned into silence for a moment. Then the shock gave way to a simmering anger. "That's not true," he said firmly. "I've done no such thing." The officer barely reacted, as though he'd expected the denial. "We'll need you to come with us to answer some questions. Standard procedure." Evelyn stepped forward, her small frame bristling with quiet fury. "Standard procedure. My son's done nothing wrong, and you're treating him like a criminal. This is ridiculous." "Ma'am, please," the second officer said, raising a placating hand. "We're just following up on the report." Marcus put a hand on his mother's shoulder, gently guiding her back. "It's okay, Mama," he said quietly. "I'll handle this." He turned back to the officers, his gaze steady. "Let me grab my jacket." The ride to the station was tense but silent. Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing. This wasn't just about inconvenience. It was about sabotage. Walter was trying to smear his name, to paint him as a threat, and the worst part was that the system would probably back him up. At the station, Marcus was led to a sterile, windowless room where an officer sat waiting with a recorder. The interrogation began with clipped questions, probing his interaction with Walter and the bank staff. Marcus answered each one calmly, recounting the events in detail. He didn't raise his voice, didn't let the rising frustration show, but inside he felt the weight of every word being twisted against him. "Mr. Davis," the officer said finally, his tone skeptical, "you're telling us you didn't raise your voice or make any threatening gestures during the incident?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Marcus replied. "In fact, I recorded part of the encounter on my phone." The officer's eyes flickered with surprise. Marcus pulled out his phone, showing him the video he had captured, a calm, measured confrontation in which Walter's condescension was on full display. The officer watched in silence, his jaw tightening slightly as the footage played. When it ended, Marcus leaned back in his chair. "If you're looking for threats, you're not going to find them. What you will find is a bank manager trying to bully me into submission." The officer didn't respond immediately, but his expression softened slightly. "We'll need to verify this," he said, standing up. "Stay here." Marcus sat alone for what felt like hours. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but more than that, he felt the sting of frustration. He had done everything right, kept his composure, documented the interaction, stayed within the bounds of professionalism, and yet here he was, sitting in a police station because of a lie. Finally, the door opened, and the officer returned, his expression unreadable. "You're free to go," he said. "We've reviewed the footage and spoken to the bank. There's no evidence to support their claims." Marcus stood, his jaw tightening. "Will there be consequences for filing a false report?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The officer hesitated. "That's not our call," he said. "You'll have to take it up with the bank." Marcus nodded tightly and walked out without another word. Outside, the sunlight was blinding after the dim confines of the station. He took a deep breath, the anger inside him burning hotter. Walter had crossed a line, and Marcus knew he couldn't let it go unanswered. Later that evening, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen. The real estate deal he had been working on for months was hanging by a thread. The delays caused by Walter's antics had thrown off his timeline, and the sellers were growing impatient. He tapped his fingers against the table, his mind racing. He thought of his mother, of Mia, of the people in Ridgeline counting on him. Giving up wasn't an option. As he sat there, his phone buzzed. It was David. "Got something for you," the journalist said without preamble. "It's big." Marcus straightened, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" "An employee at Grayson just came forward," David said, "former compliance officer. She says Walter's been cooking the books for years, denying loans to minorities, falsifying records, and pocketing the difference." Marcus's breath caught. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," David replied. "She's willing to go on record. Says she's been waiting for someone to take him down." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "Send me everything you've got," he said. "It's time to end this." The next morning, Marcus met with Amelia at her office. The attorney's sharp eyes scanned the documents David had forwarded, her expression growing darker with each page. "This is gold," she said finally, looking up at Marcus. "With this, we can do more than just expose Walter. We can dismantle the whole operation." "Let's do it," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with quiet determination. As Amelia began drafting legal filings and coordinating with the whistleblower, Marcus turned his attention to the public. He worked with David to craft a story that would ignite outrage without tipping off Walter too soon. They leaked just enough to spark interest, just enough to let Walter know the walls were closing in. For days, Marcus juggled meetings, phone calls, and media inquiries, all while trying to salvage his real estate deal. The pressure was immense, but he channeled it into action, refusing to let doubt take hold. He thought of his mother's unwavering belief in him, of Mia's bright eyes filled with hope, and he pushed forward. When the story finally broke, it hit like a thunderclap. The media latched onto the allegations against Walter, amplifying the whistleblower's claims and shining a harsh light on Grayson National Bank's practices. Walter's smug confidence crumbled as the public backlash grew, his carefully curated reputation unraveling before his eyes. But for Marcus, the fight wasn't over. As he watched the news coverage from his living room, his phone buzzed with a call from Amelia. "The lawsuit's filed," she said. "It's official. Walter and the bank are going to have to answer for everything." Marcus smiled, a deep sense of satisfaction washing over him. "Good," he said. "Now let's make sure they don't get away with it." As the night wore on, Marcus sat alone in the quiet of his home, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The obstacles, the doubt, the frustration. It had all been worth it. This wasn't just about justice for himself. It was about proving that no one, not even someone like Walter, was untouchable. The room was packed, every seat taken, the buzz of hushed conversations and whispers filling the air like static electricity. Cameras clicked, pens scratched against notepads, and every eye seemed fixed on the small stage at the front of the conference room. Marcus stood just out of sight, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he refused to let it break him. This was the culmination of everything: the injustice, the struggle, the relentless pursuit of truth. This was the moment Walter Grayson's carefully constructed world would come crashing down. Amelia stood beside him, her gaze steady and reassuring. "You've got this," she said, her voice low but firm. Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." He stepped out onto the stage, and the room fell silent, the collective attention snapping to him like a taut wire. He approached the podium, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. The lights felt hot on his skin, the cameras like 100 unblinking eyes, but he didn't falter. He gripped the edges of the podium, his voice steady as he began. Good morning, my name is Marcus Davis. Many of you know me as a businessman, a community advocate, and a lifelong client of Grayson National Bank. Today, I'm here to expose the truth about what's been happening behind closed doors. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of his words sinking in. Marcus glanced to the side, where David and the whistleblower, Claire Adams, sat watching. Their presence bolstered him, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. For years, Grayson National Bank has engaged in discriminatory practices, Marcus continued, his voice rising. They've denied loans, falsified records, and targeted minority clients, people like me, not because of policy, but because of prejudice. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room, the reporters leaning forward, pens poised. Marcus paused, letting the tension build before dropping the bombshell. And the man at the center of it all is none other than Walter Grayson, the bank's regional manager. Gasps erupted, the room breaking into a frenzy of questions and flashing cameras. Marcus raised a hand, silencing the crowd. You don't have to take my word for it, he said, his tone sharp. We have evidence, emails, internal documents, testimony from employees, and today, you'll hear it all. He gestured toward Claire, who stood and approached the podium. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but her voice was steady. My name is Claire Adams, she began. I worked at Grayson National Bank for 10 years as a compliance officer. During that time, I witnessed systemic discrimination orchestrated by Walter Grayson. When I tried to report it, I was silenced and eventually forced to resign. Claire's voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on, recounting the patterns of misconduct she had uncovered. Loan applications flagged without reason, client accounts frozen under false pretenses, and directives from Walter to deny services to minority clients. The reporters scribbled furiously, their expressions a mix of shock and outrage. As Claire finished, Amelia stepped forward, presenting copies of the evidence to the crowd. This isn't just unethical, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. It's illegal, and we will ensure that every single person involved is held accountable. Marcus watched as the reporters clamored for more details, their questions overlapping in a chaotic symphony. But he wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about revealing the truth. It was about confronting the man who had caused so much harm. The next day, Marcus walked into the bank's main office building, his steps purposeful and unyielding. The boardroom was already filled when he arrived, the executives sitting stiffly around the polished oak table. Walter was at the head, his smug expression faltering slightly as Marcus entered. What is this about? Walter asked, his voice laced with irritation. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set a thick folder on the table, the sound echoing in the tense silence. It's about accountability, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Walter scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Accountability? For what? I don't have time for baseless accusations. They're not baseless, Marcus replied, his gaze locking onto Walter's, and I think you'll want to make time for this. He nodded toward Amelia, who began distributing copies of the evidence to the board members. Murmurs filled the room as the executives scanned the documents, their expressions darkening with every page. This is outrageous, Walter said, his voice rising. You can't seriously believe this nonsense. It's a smear campaign, pure and simple. Then explain the emails, Marcus shot back, his tone sharp. Explain the loan denials, the falsified records, the complaints you buried. Explain why employees like Claire Adams were forced out for trying to do the right thing. Walter's face flushed, his composure slipping. "This is a witch hunt," he spat. "You think you can come in here and destroy my reputation? I've built this bank. I've earned my place." "You didn't earn anything," Marcus said, his voice cutting through Walter's bluster. "You exploited people, silenced them, and profited from their pain, but your time is up." The room fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavy in the air. The board members exchanged glances, their unease palpable. Finally, one of them, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke up. "Walter, these allegations are serious. If there's truth to them, the consequences will be severe." Walter opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The arrogance that had defined him seemed to drain away, replaced by a flicker of fear. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction, but kept his expression neutral. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. As the meeting concluded, Walter was escorted from the room, his protests falling on deaf ears. Marcus watched him go, a sense of finality settling over him. The fight wasn't over. There would be lawsuits, investigations, and more battles to come, but for the first time, the power had shifted, and Marcus wasn't going to stop until the scales were balanced. The courtroom was silent except for the faint shuffle of papers and the occasional creak of a chair. All eyes were fixed on Walter Grayson as he sat at the defendant's table, his once pristine suit now rumpled, his face pale. The man who had once ruled his bank with smug arrogance now looked like a shadow of himself. Marcus watched from his seat near the front, his expression unreadable, but his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the culmination of months of battles, sleepless nights, and relentless determination. Walter was finally about to face justice. "Mr. Grayson," the judge's voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. "The evidence presented against you is not only overwhelming but deeply troubling. Your actions have caused significant harm, not just to individuals, but to the integrity of the institution you represented. Do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Walter stood slowly, his movements stiff and hesitant. He glanced around the room, his gaze briefly landing on Marcus. For a split second, Marcus thought he saw something resembling regret in Walter's eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Your Honor," Walter began, his voice hoarse, I made mistakes, but I never intended." "Enough," the judge interrupted sharply, her tone leaving no room for excuses. "Intentions are irrelevant when the consequences of your actions speak so clearly. You abused your position of power, and now you must face the consequences." The room was silent again as the judge delivered the sentence: years in prison for fraud, discrimination, and obstruction of justice. A collective exhale rippled through the crowd, followed by the quiet buzz of whispered conversations. Marcus didn't move, his focus still locked on Walter as the man was led away in handcuffs. It was over, or at least, this part of it was. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, and their questions flying. Marcus stood at the steps, flanked by Amelia and Claire, their presence a steadying force. He raised a hand, signaling for quiet. The crowd hushed, their anticipation palpable. "This isn't just about one man," Marcus began, his voice steady but firm. "What happened at Grayson National Bank is a reflection of a much larger problem, a system that allows discrimination and corruption to thrive. Today, we've taken a step toward accountability, but the fight isn't over. It's up to all of us to demand better." The applause was immediate and heartfelt, a wave of support that washed over Marcus and his team. He stepped back, letting Amelia and Claire field questions as he took a moment to breathe. The battle had been grueling, but the victory felt worth it. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the case sent shockwaves through the banking industry. Grayson National Bank issued a public apology, promising systemic reforms and new leadership. They implemented mandatory diversity training, revamped their lending policies, and pledged to donate millions to community development initiatives. For Marcus, it was a start, but only that. Change, he knew, wasn't about words, it was about action. Back in Ridgeline, the air was different, lighter, somehow. Marcus stood in front of the newly constructed community center, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the building. The center was everything he had envisioned, a place where kids could learn, play, and dream, where families could gather and find support, where hope could take root and grow. Uncle Marcus. Mia's voice rang out as she ran toward him, her curls bouncing with each step. He scooped her up, her laughter filling the air. "Careful, pumpkin," he said with a grin. "You're going to knock me over one of these days." Mia giggled, her eyes shining. "I can't wait to see the new library. Mama says it's the biggest one in town." Marcus's smile softened as he set her down. "It is. And it's for you and every other kid here. This is your space, Mia. Make the most of it." As the ribbon-cutting ceremony began, Marcus stood alongside Lila and Evelyn, their pride evident in their smiles. The mayor gave a short speech, praising Marcus's determination and vision, but Marcus barely heard it. His focus was on the crowd, on the faces of the people who had supported him, doubted him, and ultimately believed in him. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stepped forward, the microphone crackling slightly as he adjusted it. He looked out at the sea of faces, his heart full. "This center isn't just about bricks and mortar," he began. "It's about community. It's about giving back to the place that shaped me, that taught me the value of resilience and the power of hope. But most of all, it's about proving that no matter how many obstacles life throws at us, we can overcome them, together." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound a testament to the impact Marcus had made. He stepped back, letting the moment wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Marcus found a quiet moment to sit on the steps of the center. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the day giving way to night. Evelyn joined him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You did good, Marcus," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "Your father would have been so proud." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mama. You never let me give up." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "That's because I knew you had something special in you, and now the whole world knows it too." As they sat together, the sound of children's laughter and the hum of conversation drifting through the air, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't the end of his journey, it was just the beginning. There were more battles to fight, more barriers to break, but for now, he allowed himself to savor this moment. Somewhere out there, someone was watching his story, finding the courage to stand up and fight their own battles. And that, Marcus thought, was the greatest victory of all. The wind carried the sound of children laughing, and the faint squeak of swings moving back and forth, their rhythm as steady as the heartbeat of the town. Marcus stepped out of his car, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel path leading to the new community center. The building stood tall and bright, its modern design a stark contrast to the weathered storefronts that had once defined Ridgeline. It looked out of place in the best possible way, a symbol of hope, of progress, of what determination could build against all odds. He stood there for a moment, letting the sight sink in. It was everything he had envisioned and more. The broad glass windows reflected the clear blue sky, and the green space surrounding it buzzed with activity. Families sat on picnic blankets, children darted across the playground, and teenagers gathered on the basketball court, their sneakers scuffing the pavement. The sight filled Marcus with a quiet pride that made his chest tighten and his eyes sting. He had fought for this, every inch of it, and seeing it now, alive with energy and purpose, made all the battles worthwhile. "Uncle Marcus," a familiar voice rang out, and he turned just in time to see Mia running toward him. Her curls bounced with each step, and her face was lit with pure joy. She barreled into him, wrapping her small arms around his waist. "Did you see the new library? It has so many books. Mama said I can read as many as I want." Marcus laughed, crouching down to her level. "I did see it, pumpkin, and I made sure they put in a whole section just for kids like you." Mia's eyes widened. "Really? Like, all mine?" "All yours," Marcus said, smiling as he ruffled her hair. "But you have to share, okay?" She nodded solemnly, the seriousness of the responsibility etched on her young face. "Okay, but only if they promise to take care of the books." "They will," Marcus assured her, standing as Lila approached, her smile as bright as the sunlight spilling over the scene. "You're a hero around here, you know that," Lila said, slipping an arm around his shoulder. Marcus shook his head, his smile turning modest. "I just wanted to give the town what it deserves, what we all deserve." "Well, you did more than that," Lila said, her voice soft. "You gave them hope." As they walked toward the building, Marcus caught snippets of conversations, parents praising the after-school programs, seniors marveling at the fitness center, kids excitedly planning their next visit. It was a far cry from the ridgeline he had grown up in, where dreams were often crushed under the weight of poverty and neglect. This was a new ridgeline, one where possibilities seemed endless. Inside the community center, Marcus paused in the library, the walls lined with shelves that stretched to the ceiling. A young girl sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a brightly colored picture book. An elderly man nodded approvingly as he scanned the newspapers near the window. It was exactly what Marcus had envisioned, a space for everyone, a place to learn, to grow, to dream. "Mr. Davis," a voice called out, and Marcus turned to see the mayor approaching, her hand extended in greeting. "This place is incredible. Truly, I don't think we can thank you enough." Marcus shook her hand, his grip firm but warm. "No thanks needed, this is just the beginning." "It's already changing lives," the mayor said, gesturing toward the bustling activity around them. "You've given this town something we haven't had in a long time, pride." Marcus nodded, his heart swelling, but even as he soaked in the praise, his mind wandered back to how far they'd come, and how much had changed since that fateful day at the bank. The scandal surrounding Walter Grayson had shaken the banking world to its core. The trial had been headline news for weeks, the revelations exposing not just one man's corruption, but the systemic flaws that allowed it to thrive. Walter had been sentenced to prison, his smug arrogance replaced by a defeated silence. Grayson National Bank, desperate to salvage its reputation, had implemented sweeping reforms. Diversity training was now mandatory, and an independent oversight committee had been established to review all lending practices. They even reached out to Marcus, offering him a seat on the advisory board. He had accepted, not for personal gain, but to ensure that no one else would face what he had endured. The changes didn't stop there. Inspired by Marcus's story, other whistleblowers came forward, exposing similar practices at banks across the country. It was as if a dam had broken, the ripple effects sparking a wave of accountability and reform. Marcus's fight had become a catalyst for something much larger, a movement. Back in the present, Marcus found himself outside again, sitting on a bench beneath a towering oak tree. Mia climbed up beside him, her legs swinging as she hummed a tune only she seemed to know. Evelyn joined them moments later, her presence as steady and reassuring as it had always been. "You've built something beautiful here, Marcus," Evelyn said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "I had a lot of help," Marcus replied, his gaze fixed on the families enjoying the center. and a lot of inspiration. Evelyn smiled, her hand resting gently on his arm. Your father would have been so proud of you. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tightening. I just wanted to make things better. For Ridgeline, for Mia, for all of us. And you did, Evelyn said. You didn't just make things better, you made them right. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the town, Marcus leaned back, his heart full. This wasn't the end of the story. There was still work to be done, challenges to face, but it was a moment to savor. A moment that proved the power of resilience, of community, of standing up for what was right. Mia leaned her head against his arm, her small voice breaking the quiet. Do you think we can do more, Uncle Marcus? Like, help even more people? Marcus smiled, his eyes shining. I think we can do anything, Pumpkin, anything at all. And as the laughter of children and the murmur of conversation filled the air, Marcus felt a deep, unshakable certainty. They had come so far, and there was no limit to how much further they could go. Together, they could change the world, one step at a time.